It's interesting because in a sense, you could say that sunk cost, also kind of scales up into what you might call some of the progress traps of capitalism, that have caused, it brought so much good, but are also, economic growth is driving climate change, inequality, and so on. And so maybe we need to reimagine a lot of that. So actually, it ties together with a few other thoughts that I had for you. So obviously, marketers mostly do our work within organizations. It's what lets us do it. But I've often lamented that there isn't more opportunity for people to essentially market the common good. And one of our members recently has been lamenting that in the case of governments, typically governments pull quite blunt levers. They pull the lever of legal compulsion. They pull the lever of financial incentive. But they do very little to induce voluntary pro-social behavior, either in individuals or in organizations. So as a quick thought experiment, if Joe Biden passed a law tomorrow that made it mandatory to accept job offers from a president, and 5 minutes later, he gave you a call and said, Mr. Godin, I'm creating an unprecedented role in the history of the country. I'm going to create a chief marketing officer for the United States. And you can choose how you want to define the role for all time and what your priorities would be at the moment. So how would you define the role? What priorities would you pursue?
It's a fairly juicy hypothetical, but I'd just go to jail instead. The thing is, there's a long history of the evolution of governance. And I mean, Karl Popper has written about it brilliantly. Plato was completely wrong about it, and all the ways in between. But society and culture are not driven by republics and democracies. They are driven by people like us do things like this. And the question is, what systems can we put in place to amplify the good stuff and diminish the bad stuff? And it's naive to say that that has never happened. It has always happened. So it happens at work where certain people get promoted or winked at or congratulated. It happens in school where certain kids get beat up behind the building. And it happens in countless other places. What we haven't done a good job of since the demise of organized religion as the moderator of these standards is coming up with other ways to reinforce what they are. So if you think about, an intellectual magazine, whether it's Nature or Scientific American or the New Yorker, people like us do things like this. There's a way you're supposed to talk. There's a way you're supposed to use apostrophes. There's a set of topics you talk about and a set of topics that you don't. That is built into the culture, but it's largely unexamined. And I think if we started having straight up democratic votes about it, it wouldn't work. And I think that there's enough downside to organized religion that most people aren't hoping that one human being is going to be in charge of what's allowed and what's not. So let me share a couple stories about this idea of community action and standards. The first one was, I went to college in Boston, not at Harvard. And in 1979, throughout campus, there was a sign, hundreds of them on trees, on a Monday morning. And it was very short and very simple. It said, Wednesday is wear blue jeans if you're gay day. That's all it said. And it was magnificent to see what happened because it put everybody into a tizzy. Should I wear jeans? Because I'm not gay. Should I wear jeans? Because I am not gay, right? Like, is this about solidarity? Is it about identification? And for the first time, every single person of the 4,000 people on campus had to think to themselves about what does it even mean to have that label? What does it mean to support people who have or who want or who resist that label? And I loved that it wasn't ad driven. It was just a flyer, but it was mostly community driven. People like us do things like this. The second story, the town in which I live is pretty small. It's only 13 miles from New York City. and it has great public schools. That's one of its highlights. It's also economically diverse, which is why part of the reason it's a great place to live. In the US, there's a Department of Education gives a blue ribbon to schools who meet a certain standard. It's pretty rare. And the elementary school regularly won that. Anyway, the way that the law works is that there's a school budget, and if it doesn't pass, then the district gets one more chance 6 weeks later. And if it doesn't pass the second time, the state takes over and makes draconian cuts in the budget. And in my town, there had been a shift because wealthier people were moving in. So the economic diversity was still here. 20% of the houses had a household income of under 20,000 pounds. And taxes were going up because schools of this quality were expensive to maintain. And a significant portion, particularly elderly, felt left behind. And the school district lost the budget for the first time. And the discussions about this were not going well. They were not going well because it was about, well, you sent your kids to school years ago. Why can't we send our? And it was blameful and divisive. 6 days before the second vote, which wasn't going to work, 3 people in town went to a stationery store and bought 100 feet of blue ribbon. And from the biggest tree in the center of town, which everyone drove past, they hung 100 blue ribbons. And over the next 5 days, without these 3 people doing anything, blue ribbons began to spread. And on the eve of the election, there were thousands of blue ribbons around town. And you've already guessed the budget won 2-1. Mm. And the reason it won is not because they persuaded the people who had voted against it that they were wrong. It's because they activated the people who hadn't voted last time. People like us do things like this. What it means to be in this community. Are you part of this? And so I think while I am in favor of guardrails, while I am in favor of cultural principles, I also know that human beings who say, not on my watch, who say, I'm going to stand up for this, that is ultimately where culture begins. That is ultimately what makes culture change.